And now I'd like you to give a big warm welcome to Lord Paul Boateng, who's going to inaugural lecture, Revitalising the African Hinterland.
Patrons, Oku, Audrey, Alexander, sisters and brothers, it's great to be with you here this evening in Senate House, and I'm delighted to be giving the Memorial 2007 inaugural lecture. Memory and the tangible recognition of the past through monuments and commemoration in words and song represent, I think, not simply an acknowledgement of a legacy and the consequence of past events, but represent too and should act as a spur to future action. And I salute the campaign and its ongoing efforts in this respect. It's so valuable and so important, not least at this particular time in our history. What I'm going to seek to do in the course of my remarks this evening is to draw attention to the dire consequences of slavery for the economic and political development of the African continent, consequences which have contributed to some present challenges, and I will touch upon those. But I will also seek to suggest an urgent need for an approach to development that seeks to address and redress the distortions in development and post-colonial governance that have contributed to the neglect of Africa's rural heartland and its communities. So many of them farmers, too many of them seeking to eke out an existence on less than $1 a day as subsistence farmers, the prey to ethnic and religious conflict, which themselves represent a real and continuing threat to the realization of Africa's extraordinary potential. Africa, the oldest, geologically, continent, and yet the youngest, demographically, in terms of its population, the poorest in terms of per capita income and gross domestic product, and yet the richest in terms of its natural abundance. An abundance and a richness that sets it apart from all other continents and represents the last best hope for a world where growth outside Africa is either stalling or, even where it is growing, is in itself threatened by market rigidities which propel the newly emergent economic powers of the East to seek in Africa, as both India and China do, along with Japan and South Korea, a new relationship that is founded on the needs of their economies for new markets and sources of goods and labor, which only Africa can provide. We cannot, however, find a way forward that is founded on economic stability and sustainability, on equity and political security, without recognizing the need, first, to understand the complexities of our past and the role of slavery in that, and the fallout from this abominable trade, which continues to this day. This fallout, economically, politically, psychologically, was compounded by the sheer scale of slavery on the continent. Between 1400 and 1900, the African continent experienced 4 simultaneous slave trades. The largest, beginning in the 15th century, saw slaves shipped on an industrial scale from the west coast of Africa, from West and Central Africa and East Africa to the New World. But there were, of course, 3 other slave trades taking place simultaneously, much older and predating the transatlantic slave trade. And these were the Trans-Saharan, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean slave trades. These actually lasted longer and indeed continue in some areas to this day, albeit in a modified form. But the UN research and investigation into modern-day slavery suggests that you are more likely to be made a slave in Mauritania, and indeed in half a dozen other African countries, than you are likely to be made a slave anywhere else in the world. And that is something, too, for us to think about as we commemorate slavery, its evils, its consequences, and the struggle to resist it. But when you actually bore down into the reality of these 4 simultaneous slave trades, that reality becomes even more horrific, because there are a number of characteristics of Africa's slave trade which make them distinct from previous slave trades globally. The first was the sheer volume of numbers. The total volume of slaves traded was literally without precedent. During the transatlantic slave trade alone, approximately 12 million slaves were exported from Africa. Another 6 million were exported in the other 3 slave trades. And these figures don't include those who were killed during the raids or those who died on their journey to the coast. So Patrick Manning, the renowned scholar in this field, calculates that by 1850, Africa's population was only half of what it would have been had the slave trades not taken place. But Africa's slave trades were also unique because, unlike previous slave trades, individuals of the same or similar ethnicities enslaved one another. And this had particularly detrimental consequences, including social and ethnic fragmentation, political instability, and a weakening of states and the corruption of judicial institutions. And we live with those consequences to this day. And I don't think any examination of this subject would be appropriate without recognition and respect being given to the likes of Basil Davidson and Walter Rodney, who a number of us in this room knew and were privileged to meet as children and as young men and women. And Walter Rodney put it in this way, and I think it's worth quoting from his seminal work, How Europe Undeveloped Africa, published in 1972. And I am looking around me, can see a number of people who were present in this very city when he lectured around the publication of that book. We had flares then, didn't we? I had an afro. At least one person here I know had hair. That's just the way it was then. But what Walter said then, and it rings true to this day. He made the point that the slave trade discouraged state building and encouraged slave raiding. It encouraged the capture of slaves for sale and discouraged the capture of land and the cultivation of a citizenry for the purposes of taxation. And he put it in this way specifically. There have been times in history when social groups have grown stronger by raiding their neighbours for women, cattle, and the goods, because they then use the booty from those raids for the benefits of their own community. Slaving in Africa did not even have that redeeming value. Captives were shipped outside instead of being utilized within any given African community for creating wealth from nature. And he went on to say, if the prisoners were to develop into a true serf class, then those prisoners would have had to be guaranteed the right to remain fixed on the soil and protected from sale. They were, of course, guaranteed no such right. But also, and significantly, even where there was, and the other three slave trades, along with the transatlantic slave trade, built on this fact, even where there was, in effect, a form of local serfdom, a form of extreme indentured labour. The impact of the transatlantic slave trade in particular, so great was the demand, was to cause the African elite and the tribal elites who are practicing that particular form of labour utilisation, to cause them to cease that and to export even those people for the immediate benefit and gratification of the market and the appetite for slaves. And the most common manner in which slaves were taken was through villages or states raiding one another. Where groups of villages had previously developed into larger scale village federations, relationships between the villages tended to turn hostile, and as a result, ties between the villages were weakened, which in turn impeded the formation of larger communities and broader ethnic identity. Kusimba writes that insecurity confined people within ethnic boundaries, constructing spheres of interaction. And because of this process, the slave trades may well have had and were an important factor in explaining the high level of ethnic fractionalization that exists today. And this in turn was significant for economic development, given the established relationship between ethnic fractionalization and long-term economic growth. And studies have indicated, examining the post-colonial period and the huge discrepancies in development between the East and Africa, have seen the impact of this ethnic and tribal fractionalization as having a particularly adverse effect on subsequent development. And if you reflect on that, reflect on the fact that Malaysia started with exactly the same GDP in 1957 as Ghana. If you reflect on the fact that Dr. Azikwe gave on the formation of the new Nigeria, Tunku Abdul Rahman, not just the plants, but the technicians, the agriculturists, the researchers around the palm oil production gave them to Tunku Abdul Rahman, literally, as part and parcel of aid to celebrate the independence of the Malaysian Federation and Nigeria. We know what happened subsequently. In due course, the Nigerian palm oil production collapsed. Malaysia is now the largest producer of palm oil and its products in the world. Now, there are a number of explanations for that, but undoubtedly there is a consequence to the slave trade, a cultural impact, an economic impact of the slave trade, which had a profound effect on the divergence of the experience between the tiger economies of Asia and the economies of Africa. So the precise nature of the channel of causality underlying the relationship between slave exports and economic development is still the subject of academic research. But there's no doubt that the procurement of slaves through internal warfare, raiding, kidnapping, resulted in subsequent state collapse and ethnic fractionalization, the consequences of which we continue to live with. The great kingdoms of Benin and Dahomey were all impacted upon by the wars that occurred throughout that period, wars that were made that much worse by first a gun slave cycle and then an iron slave cycle. A vicious cycle that had communities raiding each other for slaves in order to purchase guns, in order to carry out more raids, and then in order to purchase iron and metal goods. Iron and metal goods that were, in fact, prior to the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, developed in homegrown industries in kingdoms like Benin. And you've only got to walk a few hundred yards from this very building to the British Museum to see the product of metal industry in Benin. Artifacts of incredible beauty and sophistication. What happened to all of that? Well, we know what happened. We then had, as a result of that, an impact that was to be seen not simply in the internal conflict that increased political instability and caused the collapse of pre-existing forms of government. We saw that in relation to Senegambia. We saw that perhaps most dramatically illustrated in the collapse of the Congo, K-O-N-G-O kingdom of West Central Africa, when as early as 1514 the kidnapping had reached such a state that it threatened the social order and the king's own authority. At that time, kings of Portugal and kings of Congo met literally on equal terms. But by 1526, Alfonso, king of the Congo, wrote to his Portuguese counterpart claiming, "There are so many of your traders in all corners of the country. They bring ruin to the country. Every day people are enslaved and kidnapped, even nobles, even members of my own, the king's own family." That's just one illustration of the impact on one kingdom of the slave trade at the time. So, that is the historic background. The question now is, what's to be done? What's to be done? how do we begin at this time, in this particular period of history, in the 21st century, how do we begin to learn the lessons of the time, and how do we begin to build institutions which will take us through this present century in ways that seek to reverse the negative consequences of the slave, colonial, and post-colonial period, in terms of ethnic division, in terms of tribal conflict, in terms of the breakdown of inclusive forms of governance, of the rule of law. How now do we promote agriculture? How do we promote governance arrangements that are conducive to development and to growth, and that are consistent with the culture and with the traditions of Africa, so that they are sustainable and sustained and able to resist the external shocks to which Africa has been subject in the past, and which it has not been able to resist. And the greatest of those external shocks was the transatlantic slave trade. But it was a shock that came to a continent that itself had its own indigenous, endemic form of slavery, which was itself an adverse influence on its own future economic development. And what I will seek to suggest in this part of my remarks is that when you look for the lessons of the post-colonial period, a number of things become clear. And I just give you this simple example from my own life and times. I was christened in a place called Achimtafo. Achimtafo is in the eastern region of Ghana. It is famous for its cocoa. My grandparents, my paternal grandparents, were cocoa and cassava farmers. Cocoa and cassava farmers in Tafo. And to give you an indication of what it was to be a cocoa and cassava farmer in the 1940s and 50s, they were able, from the proceeds of their cassava and cocoa farm, small, medium-sized farm, a number of small family farms farmed together, as is often the practice in the cocoa growing areas of West Africa. But from the product of that farm, they were able to send my father first to Fura Bay College in Sierra Leone, and from there to King's College, London, to read for the bar. Now, perfectly true. My father supplemented that with earnings from Lyons Corner House, which was the McDonald's of its day, and working in a toy factory in Walthamstow. But nevertheless, my grandfather was able to educate his son from the proceeds of the cocoa farm, with the support of my grandmother, who farmed cassava. That could not happen today. That is unthinkable today from the proceeds of cocoa and cassava farming. Well, what's changed? Not simply the global market for cocoa. Two things have changed in particular, which I suggest are indicative of a wider issue for Africa as we seek to revitalize our hinterland. First, in the 1940s and 50s, there was a direct rail link between the cocoa-growing areas of Ghana, around Achim Tafo, and Takoradi Harbour. That rail link no longer exists, along with much of the rail infrastructure of sub-Saharan Africa. So the transport costs, the transactional costs of cocoa farming were lower then than they are now, because my grandfather was able to take the cocoa straight from his farm to the rail spur and to export it straight out of the country. Another important difference: my grandparents' farms, again remember, small farms contributing essentially to a medium-sized farm, were immediately adjacent to something called the West African Cocoa Research Institute in New Tafo. Now, the West African Cocoa Research Institute produced regularly, every year, at least a dozen PhDs in agricultural research. It was a world-renowned institute of higher education in agriculture. The Cocoa Research Institute in Tafo today is no longer the West African Cocoa Research Institute, so it no longer provides a resource, a capacity building, a resource for its farmers for the whole of the region, an integrated resource for the region. But it doesn't produce any homegrown PhD students at all. Now, my paternal grandparents were able to access improved cocoa plants, improved cassava plants and techniques directly from the Agricultural Research Institute. It was the one advantage, my grandmother used to say, of knowing that in fact the land upon, a part of the land upon which the Cocoa Research Institute was built was stolen from her, appropriated by the colonial administration. We've never sought compensation. My grandmother took the view of, well, swings and roundabouts. She was a philosophic and wise woman. But she and all the other farmers had direct benefit from that. They no longer have any agricultural extension services at all. And that is a direct result of policy whose origins lie in the policies of the IMF and the World Bank, the structural readjustment, the World Bank's decision not to invest and not to encourage investment at that time, since reversed, post-Africa Commission. But there was to be no investment in infrastructure, there was to be no investment in agriculture. That was not the policy of the time. And indeed, subsequent Ghanaian governments after Kwame Nkrumah did not invest until 10 years ago. Until then, Ghanaians didn't invest in agriculture. That's just one example. It can be replicated all over Africa. And the consequences to be seen in agricultural production in Africa today. And let me just give you some stats. Farm yields on the continent of Africa are now amongst the lowest in the world. Per capita agricultural output in Africa today is only 56% of the world average. If you look at investment in agriculture and its consequences, it makes sorry reading. Whilst high-income countries add nearly $185 of value by processing 1 ton of agricultural products, Developing countries, those in Africa, add only $40. Furthermore, while 98% of agricultural production in high-income countries undergoes industrial processing, barely 38% is processed in African developing countries. The ratio of value added in agribusiness to that in farming is only 0.6 in agriculture-based countries, most of them in Africa, compared with 2 for transforming countries, mostly in Asia, India, Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, 3.3% in urbanized countries, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Mexico, and Latin America, and 13 in the US. So that's the spectrum. 0.6 in Africa, 13 in the US, in terms of investment in agri processing. And so it goes on. If you look at the issue of the cost of in investment in agriculture in Africa, in terms of value chains, a 1% fall in the costs in Africa in relation to sub-Saharan food manufacturing would increase output by about 0.65%. In Kenya, in Côte d'Ivoire by about 0.4%, and in Namibia and Senegal likewise. Lowering the costs between the farm gate and the food factory door, including transportation, going back to the point about the rail spur, and refrigeration, could lead to a 0.7% increase in Côte d'Ivoire's food manufacturing output, and generally 0.6% in most other sub-Saharan African countries, with the lowest gains being at 0.2%. So that's the scale of the problem. And without that issue of transportation infrastructure, of research and development, of the availability of agricultural processing capacity, the availability of improved seeds and water irrigation, the hinterland of Africa will continue to be not simply underutilized. 65% of the world's underutilized arable land is in Africa. Will not simply continue to be underutilized, it will lead to a situation in which Africa, as I said, the youngest, the fastest growing population of the world, will not only continue to be unable to feed itself, because the reality is now that Africa is a net importer of food, but that situation will actually get worse by 2030 to such an extent that there will be widespread food shortages, and the hunger and nutrition issues that we experience in Africa now will be more than 50% greater then. So that's the scale of the challenge. But there is good news. And the good news is that African policymakers have woken up to that challenge, that both the Africa Union and the regional economic entities that now exist in Africa, beginning to deal with the fragmentation that was the product of the slave trades, of which I have referred in the course of my remarks. So ECOWAS, SADC, the East African Economic Community, all of them now are prioritizing both agriculture and rural infrastructure as areas for sustained investment. That's the good news in terms of policy. The less good news is that of the 44 African countries for which they are statistics, only 9 of those countries have in fact hit the 10% of spending that the AU has said ought to be spent on agriculture. So the amount that still has to be spent and the catching up that still has to be done is not insubstantial. Good news, however, that if you take Ethiopia as an example, yesterday, the first major rail product to be delivered in Africa in the past 50 years was opened, the line between Addis and Djibouti. It's a modern, standard gauge rail line that will revolutionize the transportation in the Horn of Africa. And it is part and parcel of a network that is due to be developed across East and the Horn of Africa. It has come about largely because of Chinese investment. And so what we are now seeing in Africa are new players coming onto the scene and providing an alternative to the usual sources of capital. But capital starvation, risk aversion, an inability of the banks to be able adequately to mitigate risks in terms of their loans to farmers continues to hold small and medium farmers back. And it's small and medium farmers who are the backbone of the realization of Africa's potential in agriculture. And so the call to us and the call to action that this maquette and that this memorial, when erected, will represent is a call for a wider awareness of the need for us all to look to the future with reference to the past, its complexities, its legacy, as a stimulus to action now for policies which we all have a contribution to make to. Because what we have learned in the past, I think it's fair to say in the past 15 years, certainly, since the collapse of the previous development policies adhered to by the IMF and the World Bank, and the beginning to fashion a new dispensation to meet new times. What we have learned is that there has to be engagement between both the private and the public sectors in this area. That yes, there needs to be, and the UK, to its credit, under all political parties, has committed, the only G7 country to commit to 0.7% of its GDP to overseas development assistance. That's a considerable commitment and not to be taken for granted, and one to continue to mobilize around. But what we know is that aid by itself is not enough. On the contrary, that aid by itself can lead to an undue and dangerous situation in which countries look externally rather than internally for the generation of revenue and policy ideas. But what we have learned is that you need public and private engagement, that you need the private sector to drive development, and to drive market-driven approaches that are sustainable, so that farmers have access to markets. This isn't wishful thinking. I've seen for myself through the work of the Africa Enterprise Challenge Fund, a Pan-African fund supported by global donors. I've seen for myself in Kenya a classic example of that. Again, worth reflecting on briefly. The common runner bean. Runner beans, which in mainland Europe are often sold and eaten in jars. It's not something which you can pick up very readily at Waitrose or Lidl or anywhere else, but nevertheless, in mainland Europe, that's how lots of runner beans are eaten. Very interesting. Until, 4 years ago, the overwhelming bulk of those runner beans in jars came from China. As the Chinese economy has grown, just as the Chinese now eat more meat and drink more milk, they now eat more beans. So the supply of bottled runner beans has dried up, so to speak. That has been, that supply, however, has been taken up by Kenyan farmers who grow, and a number of you may have tasted them in package form. Very good runner beans. You can certainly get those in Tesco's, Waitrose, Sainsbury's, and Lidl. But local agricultural processors in Kenya did not have the wherewithal to raise capital locally in order to bottle runner beans. So they made an application to the African Enterprise Challenge Fund for $1 million. They themselves raised capital through their own and other sources to open up now, and you can see it for yourself, outside in a factory outside Nairobi, 2 production lines producing bottled runner beans. And they are now providing, literally, a income source which didn't exist before for hundreds more Kenyan small and medium-sized farmers. So this is not some sort of airy-fairy economic theory. It's happening now. But it requires, one, continuing commitment on the part of the donors, but it also requires that African governments create an enabling environment for investment. And the Kenyan government, to its credit, has done just that. Similarly, the Nigerian government has created an enabling environment out of the need to diversify its oil-based economy for agriculture in Nigeria. To take just 2 examples from different sides of the continent. And the good news is that the former agriculture minister of Nigeria, Akin Adesina, is now the president of the Africa Development Bank. And I want to begin to draw my remarks to a close by a quote from him. "We must support the African private sector to create wealth and to widen the tax base. By developing financial markets and attracting private capital from Africa and abroad, businesses can access long-term financing crucial for investment to drive industrialization. By rejecting a one-size-fits-all model for development, we can build more resilient, sustainable economies and reduce fragility. Curbing illicit outflows of capital, not just through regulation, but by improving domestic investment returns, will improve Africa's self-funding capacity. All this reinforces confidence in Africa's political, economic, and social institutions, and in their ability to foster inclusive growth. Underline the words inclusive growth. This is not simply a matter for Africans' burgeoning cities. The main motors of growing wealth, Africa's rural areas, need help to climb out of poverty. Revamping rural infrastructure, expanding rural energy, mobile telephony and access to finance will speed up income growth, employment, financial inclusion and education, enhancing livelihoods across our rural areas. It's not rocket science. There is a way forward. The way forward has been mapped out. The policies actually are in place. But what is needed now is delivery. To move from rhetoric to action. We need the spur. We need the goad of memory. We need, when we turn on our television screens and witness events in South Sudan, to remember how it all started. A few years ago, there was a wonderful exhibition, again, just a few 100 yards from here at the British Museum, that traced the historical origins of the conflict in the Sudan. There's a direct link between the tragedy that we are seeing or not seeing enough of, but it's taking place all the time on our television screens. A horrendous and fratricidal civil war. There's a direct link between those events and the legacy of the Red Sea and Indian Ocean Arab slave trade. A direct link. Those tribes were set one against the other by their northern neighbors. Those tribes raided one another, were themselves in turn raided to feed the Arab slave trade. That is the reality. And it has left wounds. It has had an impact that lasts to this day. Just a few weeks ago, I was part and parcel of a mediating activity that took place under the auspices of the African Bible Societies between members of Parliament and representatives of the warring factions and tribes in South Sudan. Their plea to us was for the world to wake up to what's happening there, for the world to take note, for the world to support the Africa Union peace initiative that is seeking to bring all the different sides together, and that is seeking resources to do just that. Resources initially to impose peace, but then resources subsequently to build peace through a process of reconciliation. That requires will. That requires political will in Africa and externally to Africa. It requires us to remember the origins of the conflict and our collective responsibility wherever we are in the world for one another. So let's remember that and the importance of memory when we think of the Southern Sudan. And then secondly, much, much closer to home. Just, what? It was 100 miles away, is it? 120 miles away, Sangat. We're going to see a lot of that, and of the breaking up of that camp in the next few days. We've been told it's going to be broken up, and we've been told by the French police themselves it's going to be broken up by force. We know that there are scores of children in that camp, that there are many vulnerable people in that camp. We know that when that camp is broken up, the people will presumably be dispersed, but the source of people will remain. That people will continue to flee ethnic and religious conflict. That people will continue to seek an escape from poverty. That the lands from which they are seeking to escape themselves do not have a sufficient productive capacity and hope for growth to provide gainful occupations for the countless numbers of young men and women and children who we see fleeing the continent at this time. And this horrendous trafficking of people, this migration, mimics, does it not, in the most horrendous way, in the sights we see of bodies washed up, in what we know happens to those who fall into the hands of the modern day people capturers, doing what was after all done for centuries and has been done for centuries, forcing people into labour, both before and after the horrendous passage across the Mediterranean. We know, again in a horrendous mimicking of events in the transatlantic slave trade, that people have been literally thrown to their deaths into the water by the people traffickers. Quite deliberately murdered in that way. And we know, don't we, that that itself represents a call to action. The question is whether or not we will heed that call. But we have an opportunity, not necessarily one which we sought, but which nevertheless exists now in the aftermath of Brexit, to refashion our trading relationship with Africa, to make it a more equitable and a more development-focused one. Because anyone with any familiarity with the negotiations that have taken place around the European Economic Partnership agreements knows that the UK has consistently argued in Brussels, not always successfully, for economic partnership agreements, which are the partnership agreements between the European Economic Community, between the European Union and the regional economic entities in Africa, that the UK has consistently, to its credit, under successive governments, argued for a greater and a more developmental focus to those partnership agreements. It has not always been successful. And the outcome of some of those partnership agreements has frankly been fought tooth and nail on the continent as being adverse and contrary to their interests. SADC still has not signed up to the economic partnership agreements. Tanzania, in the aftermath of Brexit, has said it will not sign up to the economic partnership agreement. Kenya, quite understandably, in order to seek to protect its horticultural industry in particular, has been forced to sign up, but not willingly. Not willingly. Well, we now have an opportunity with Brexit to take a different approach. We have an opportunity as a country with Brexit now to lead the way in this regard, as we have in regard to a number of other aspects of our development policy, and to argue that African farmers and growing nascent African industry should have access to our market, at any rate, that is free from tariff and non-tariff barriers. That's something we can do now to make a difference. And I would argue that this movement, the movement for a memorial to remind us all of the legacy, could be an important part of that movement for a freer, fairer, and a more developmentally positive and sensitive approach to trade. One that promotes regional integration, one that promotes and encourages inter-African trade and increases access to global markets. Now is a time, a Kairos time, a time of risk and opportunity. We know the risk, we know the threats, but there is an opportunity to be taken. But it does require that Africa, Africans, friends of Africa, and Africans, and the diaspora, who are, after all, a product both of the transatlantic trade and the migration, voluntary and involuntary, that followed it from the continent. It requires us all to seize the moment. And we in the UK to take the lead. And I close, if I may, on this. I'm an honorary Beijing, in that I'm married to a Beijing. And 200 years ago, between the 14th and 16th of April 1816, there was a rebellion. A rebellion in Barbados, led by a man called Bussa, B-U-S-S-A, an African-born slave. And he led the first of what turned out to be 3 large-scale rebellions across the West Indies, which shook public faith here in the UK in slavery, and which contributed to the achievement of Equiano and Wilberforce and the others, of which we have heard sung about so movingly this evening. The achievement of what became the Emancipation Act. And he was joined in this rebellion by this remarkable woman by the name of Nanny Grigg. It was suppressed with enormous brutality. A suppression that, although initially successful, proved ultimately, as we know, futile. And there we have illustrated only too effectively and powerfully the resistance that lay at the heart of the struggle against slavery. But Bussa and Nanny Grigg were fueled in their rebellion by a rumour that gripped the plantations in Barbados in the weeks before the rebellion, which was carefully planned and executed. And that rumour was that the British Parliament was about to pass an act to promulgate a piece of paper that would set all the slaves free. And it was supposed to be due to be proclaimed imminently. And so the word went around the plantations. The paper come. The paper come. Well, it didn't come then, but it did come eventually. And so we saw the emancipation of the slaves. That was followed in my lifetime by the political emancipation, the independence of sub-Saharan Africa. And I can remember being present in the old polo ground as a child in 1957, when the articles of independence, the act, was presented by Princess Marina to the then first Prime Minister of Ghana, Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. The paper came, and we won our hard-fought political independence. And I hope I will live long enough to see what I have not seen yet, the economic emancipation of the continent. Because that has not happened yet. That is yet to come. But we must make sure, mustn't we, all of us in this room, Africans, African diaspora, friends of Africa, and the African diaspora, we must make sure that if that economic emancipation is to come, and it is truly to deliver Africa and its hinterland, that it is a paper written by our own hands, promulgated under African skies, not in London, not in Brussels, not in Berlin, not in Washington, not in Beijing, not in Moscow, but under African skies by Africans. And then truly we can say, the paper come, the paper come. And then, and only then, will Africa be truly free. Thank you very much.